You guys are in for a treat in the next hour. There are scholars who reinforce our prejudices and preconceptions in their work. There are other scholars who take great pleasure in dismantling them. And I have no qualms about definitely putting Johan in the second group. He's an astonishing scholar. I've, over the last 3 or 4 years, read hundreds of books on early Buddhist history. And Johan's wonderful book, Buddhism and Islam on the Silk Road, is one of the most surprising and fascinating that I read in that massive sort of COVID reading marathon. This book, which is not the book he's going to be talking about, but which is the starting point for the book he will be talking about, makes the point that the preconceptions we have of Islam as a violent, irrational religion opposed to Buddhism as a peaceful, rational religion are obviously very simplistic, and that the truth is far, far more complex, and that there are thousands of years of relationships between Buddhists and Muslims which have never really properly been documented. And I have learnt so much from Johan's work, and I was particularly thrilled that of all the authors we invited, that Johan was able to make it this time. I've learnt an enormous amount from him. His book that we will be talking about today is The Buddha's Footprint, which starts from many of the roots of that book can be found in Buddhism and Islam, but it takes forward the idea, which he first presents in this book, that Buddhism is a surprisingly capitalistic religion. This is, again, is something which surprises us, because we think of it as a very otherworldly faith, dwelling in high peaks in the Himalayas, away from anything to do with money or capitalism. But Johan shows that, in fact, that the early Buddhism spread on trading networks, and that it was Buddhists that took, particularly initially, Indian commerce to Southeast Asia, to Sri Lanka, to Burma. And the firm connection between Buddhism and money goes far deeper and it takes a very different form to that which we might expect. He then takes it further to examine the idea that Buddhism is necessarily a religion at one with nature, and comes up with some very surprising conclusions. I suspect there will be many people who will disagree and want to challenge some of the things that he says, but that's exactly what this session is here for. So please write your questions down, and we can have a very good argy-bargy afterwards. But I commend to you a wonderful scholar, and I'm going to sit down in the front row and just listen to him for the next half hour as he gives a presentation before engaging him in conversation. So Johan, take over, and I can't wait for this. Looking forward to it very much.
Thank you so much for that overwhelming praise. You raised the bar too high. It's like, how can I ever live up to this? You know, it's like, invariably just go down. But hopefully, some of my ideas will be interesting for you. And so I guess we can kind of just jump right on. I mean, William has kind of made clear what my argument is, which is that Buddhism is, I call it a proto-capitalistic religion. I basically draw my argument a lot from Max Weber's famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And so, you know, as I say in my book, if you want to think about the spread of Buddhism, I mean, again, all over Asia, it's the only religion that spread from Sri Lanka to Siberia and from Iran all the way to Japan. You know, when you see a blob of territory on Eurasia and you think about how did that happen, it's usually not done by marshmallows and pixie dust. There's inherently, I mean, if you know, I mean, the famous scholar Richard Richard Gombrich, who was the former Bowdoin professor of Sanskrit at Oxford, he famously asked the question, like, why was Buddhism so successful? And he said, it was the beauty of its thought. And Buddhism does have beautiful thought, great philosophy, and et cetera, et cetera. But if I said the same thing about Islam, communism, American empire, I would be laughed out of the academy. But because of how we think about Buddhism, nobody actually questions it. So that's the starting point. And I know, as William pointed out, people don't like this. And actually, the first time I presented this, it was actually in 2012 in Berkeley. A gentleman stood up after my talk and said, "Do you want to be, the one who, the Grinch who stole Buddhism?" Basically implying that I'm the first person to make this argument that Buddhism is not inherently environmental, as we've been told for the last 100 years. And the fact of the matter, I'm not making this argument. This is an old argument. I mean, this has been done by scholars for the last 25 years, beginning with Ian Harris and a whole bunch of other ones. But invariably, as we know, what happens in the academy doesn't necessarily trickle down into the popular discourse immediately. And particularly ideas that kind of challenge our, stereotypes that we like to cling to, that Buddhism is peaceful and rational and scientific and, the best thing going. For me, it's kind of like arguing that, that Buddhists are not inherently environmental. It's like me arguing that there's something called gravity. It's already accepted in the field, even though people don't, the general discourse doesn't accept it or it doesn't understand it. And so for me, that's not the interesting point, right? To say that Buddhists are, proto-capitalists and, they built the Dharma through resource extraction and exploiting the natives on the commodity frontier in order to glorify and, manifest the Dharma. That's just the starting point. I have other fish to fry. So let me kind of explain what those are. But at the same time, again, thinking about the gentleman in Berkeley who called me the Grinch, and maybe some of you will think I am the Grinch too. I want to be very clear that I fully support all the Buddhist communities, philosophers, activists who use the Dharma in order to promote environmental consciousness and sustainability in the current world. As we all know, we are careening into a catastrophe, and anybody who uses any religion in order to deal with the climate crisis, I support it all the better. But what's important to understand is that the Buddhist activists who are doing this have basically reverse engineered Buddhism in order to fit with modern environmental sensibilities. And my problem as a historian is when we take this modern creation and project it into the past, right? So that's where I start from. If you begin with the idea that Buddhism spread all over the place, how and why did this happen? But so again, the larger kind of intellectual project that I'm doing is what I call my 3 historiographical interventions. And they are religion matters, and using the study of Buddhist environmental history in order to do spatial reconceptualizations of historical categories. And the final one is temporal reframings. And so I want to say a little about each one of these. In terms of religion, nowadays we might kind of seem crazy to say, like, religion matters. The Christian right, Islamic fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism, Zionism, religion basically makes the world go round, for good and for bad. But in the academy, as many of you probably know, religion is not studied, right? That's why religious studies, which is the field that I'm in, was only formed in the 1960s because we were the weirdos who said, hey, religion matters in human history and human culture and human society. But other scholars don't. And historians are probably the worst, right? So this was the AHA is the American Historical Association. They did a survey in 2009. This was after 9/11, and they were like, the article was called "Finding That Old-Time Religion," and so they asked the thousands and thousands of members of the AHA who actually studies religion as a part of human history, and the answer was 3%, which to me is just absolutely shocking. But so. One thing that I want to do with this book is to say religion matters. Paul Sutter, who's here at CU, he's an environmental historian, he's the editor of the Weyerhaeuser series. He read my book and he's like, wow, we environmental historians don't even talk about religion. This is really interesting and important. And he pointed out Bill Cronin's book was famous, the Changing the Landscape, whatever it was, which looks at the history of the Puritans and Native American and colonial America. And he points out, like, Cronin doesn't even mention Christianity. And you think the Puritans, they were basically Christian fanatics, and that was the reason they were here, but it wasn't even in his conceptual wheelhouse to think, well, maybe their understanding of Christianity and biblical claims of domination of nature maybe played a role in how they, interacted with the natural environment and also with the Native Americans. So this is one thing, historians as a whole, I think, need to take religion more seriously. And in the case of Buddhism, it's even worse. Donald Lopez, some of you may know, he's a very prominent and prolific scholar of Buddhism. He edited this volume, which is very important in Buddhist studies in the early 90s, basically, which brought the post-colonial turn into the study of Buddhism. And basically, the main argument was everything you thought about Buddhism was inherently wrong. It was a construction of colonialists in the 19th century, which all of my work kind of builds on this scholarship. But he made this point that Buddhism is basically studied outside of history because the way it was constructed as a philosophy and rational and scientific, and it was all mindfulness and all the good things, it kind of floated above economic, political, and cultural realities. And so nobody plugged it into the historical narrative of Asia. But I mean, in many ways, Buddhism dominated Asian political, economic, social history for 2,000 years. So to not write about it or think about it is to like write a history of the Mediterranean and forget to mention Islam or Christianity. I mean, no historian would do that. But you can read a whole library of books of Asian history, and Buddhism is not even mentioned because it's understood to be basically outside history. And I think that's a major problem. The spatial thing, this is getting into the kind of academic weeds, but I mean, nowadays, scholarship is moving away from the nation state. I live in Texas, we have the border crisis, and so we can't say the border crisis ends at the US border, it goes all the way down to Venezuela. So we're gonna talk about, how history shapes the world. You don't stop at the Canadian border or wherever it might be. And so of course now there's Atlantic Ocean studies, Indian Ocean studies, and in Asian studies we have this new category of Inter-Asia. And of course, that's a nice idea, but how do you do it conceptually? Nobody knows all the languages, nobody knows all the histories, and how do you tie it all together? And of course, Buddhism does tie it all together because it went to all these places. And of course, wherever they went, they interacted with the environment. So that was kind of my gateway in order to engage with the idea, how can we conceptualize Asia as a unified space beyond, Cambodia or Vietnam or whatever it might be. The third and final intervention is time. Historians work with periodizations, the early modern, the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, whatever it might be. And in a certain sense, environmental history was, meant to be global and meant to be break down a lot of these periodizations. But invariably, a lot of the scholarship, as most scholarship in the Western Academy, is profoundly Eurocentric. And so one of the most important, arguments in environmental history is the Columbian Exchange, which again puts the white man in the center of history, right? They discover the New World and all these crops and products and, diseases go back and forth. And so this becomes the hinge of world history, and again, it's the white man at the center. And I think that's a problem. I think we need to, particularly considering the Anthropocene and what's happening in the world, we need to bring Asia into the story, past, present, and future. And so these are the larger intellectual arguments. So get into the material, or the kind of framework that I use. I use a model from the environmental historians of the British Empire, who, they talk about it's the architecture of the British Empire is basically commodity and resource extraction from the frontier. You conquer India and suck everything out and bring it back to the metropole of London. And I think this is a very good model to understand how Buddhism works. Buddhism is a prosperity theology. Everything was premised on the idea of making money in order to glorify the Dharma and build monasteries and stupas and all the rest of it. And so this is, an intellectual framework that I think you can use. And so in particular, I use the three developments that Buddhism was inherently tied with. Wherever they went, they brought money with them. They're going into these areas where money did not exist, and they monetized the economy. In Tibet, in Japan, Southeast Asia, they were the ones who brought money, and of course, monasteries worked as banks all over Asia. They were the largest financial institution in Asian history until the modern period. And so, they're the ones who commodified products. They wanted resin, they wanted emeralds, they wanted all this stuff. And of course, this is how they became wealthy and how they built all the beautiful monasteries that we all like to look at. The third one is agricultural expansion. Buddhism was inherently connected with the expansion of agriculture wherever they went. Every single land grant inscription at monasteries, the king is going to build a monastery, and the first thing he does is says, cut down all the forest, make all this agricultural land, and I'll give you, 1,000 slaves to operate it so you can sit and meditate and do this. And so, John McNeill, famous environmental historian, says, for 4,000 or 5,000 years, the most important development in environmental history from the founding of cities until the, modern period was agricultural expansion. And again, Buddhists were profoundly at the forefront of doing this in Asia, across Asia. And finally, urbanization, right? When you start having merchants and money and commodities and all of these extractive resources bringing things from the periphery into the metropole, we have growth of cities. And again, scholars have, explored the interaction between Buddhist monasteries and Buddhist merchants and the rise of cities in northwest India, in Sri Lanka, in China, Japan. Everywhere. So again, there's inherent connection between these two. And of course, cities are basically resource hogs, as we all know. So to get back to the central argument that Buddhists are proto-capitalist, which again, I know has a lot of intellectual baggage behind it. But again, we have this kind of, the modern Buddhist modernism, or the modern construction of Buddhism, is that Buddhism is all anti-materialist. Max Weber famously said that Buddhism lacks economic rationality, and therefore it's apolitical and otherworldly, and therefore, of course, they didn't develop capitalism. But if you read the early Buddhist corpus of text, it's saturated with wealth. Wealth is the most important thing. All of the good people, all of the morally righteous people are the wealthy. The poor are represented as stupid, not able to utilize their intellect in order to make money, and they're always the foil. And of course, the good people, the rich people, they're karmically positive, they're good Buddhists. The poor people are, they deserve it, and they are failures. And so, and the texts are filled with stories of rich people with like 4 mansions and 84,000, chariots of gold and all the rest of it. And the Buddha never condemns this. He's always glorifying wealth. That's the sign of karmic merit. And of course, that karmic merit you can transfer into social capital and status within the new merchant economy that was developing in axial age India. So again, we need to really rethink what Buddhism is. Again, it's profoundly tied into the wealth production. And again, the Buddha says what you should do is get rich, have a lot of slaves, and have a lot of land in order to make it happen. Another thing that I want to push in this book is that, again, because of the way modern Buddhism is constructed, pretty much everybody looks at the monk and says, well, whatever the monk does, that's Buddhism, right? Everybody thinks Buddhism is meditation. Of course, a whole host of scholars have pointed out that meditation was done by like 0.001% of monastics historically. They were studying and doing other things, doing transfer merit rituals, funeral rites, and all the rest of it. But again, this kind of obsession with the monk as kind of the synecdoche for the whole tradition presents a problem when you're trying to conceptualize Buddhism as a world historical force, right? Nobody would make the mistake of saying, oh, a Benedictine monk, that's Christianity, right? But in the case of Buddhism, this seems to happen all the time. And again, I think this is a major categorical mistake. And also thinking about it demographically wise, monastics were only 1% of the population, right? So using contemporary Occupy Wall Street language, what about the other 99%, right? They were the laity. They were the ones who were going out and making money and, making it possible for the monks to live in these, lavish monasteries and do what they do. And so we need to bring them into the story. They're the ones who cut down trees and, extracted resources and, killed people, in order to take their diamonds and whatever. And we also need to talk about the Buddhist state, right? Every single state is an enterprise in resource extraction in order to maintain their wealth and power and project power and all the rest of it. And so, Buddhist kingdoms, who are all over the Asian landmass. And so when we think about how Buddhism impacted, Asian history and also the environment, all three of these need to be brought into the conversation. And again, the argument, I'm not the first person to make these arguments, right? The argument that Buddhism is inherently connected with merchants and trading networks and the Silk Road and all this other stuff goes back to James Heitzman, who wrote a famous article in 1984 pointing out all these connections. And of course now there's a whole shelf of books showing exactly how and why merchants were tied into these networks, why they were involved with the Dharma, but I think all of this is all great scholarship, but I think nobody kind of pushed it far enough, or I wanted to push it further and say, yeah, we can say that merchants like the Dharma, but the question is, why did they like the Dharma? I mean, there has to be, again, the kind of Weberian argument, why did capitalism arise in Northern Europe among the Protestants is, using Silicon Valley speak, the special sauce was the Calvinist theory of predestination. You didn't know if you were going to heaven or to hell, and that uncertainty was what resulted in the development of capitalism. And I would say we need to think about Buddhism in the same way. Again, I don't have time to go into the larger arguments about all this, but again, the idea of giving and the whole ritual relationships between the monk and the laity, which is the foundational component of all Buddhist traditions, of all the three major schools, this is what made it work, right? You had to give. And of course, in order to give to the monastery, you need to have excess capital. And so this is one of the driving things. And of course, I mentioned about karma, the Buddhist teachings are saturated with the claims that only rich people are karmically positive, and Jim Scott at Yale has written about this, and justification of exploitation of minorities or people on the frontier, which Buddhist texts always talk about. I mean, they use the words like savages. It's kind of like reading like British colonial accounts from the 19th centuries. All these savages, they have all these resources, and we have to take their resources or we have to kill them. This is found in Buddhist texts, right? And so we really need to reconceptualize, what was going on. And the final one, I think it's really important. Like with predispensationalism in Calvinism, the theory of an Atman is a radical idea. It makes no sense. Why would a rich businessman want to get involved in anything like that was just so counterintuitive to pretty much every other religion on the planet? And of course, this is an Atman theory was a profound critique of the Hindu theory of the Atman and the caste system that it justified. And the Buddha, of course, was the one who ripped that whole model down and basically opened up the possibility of free will, right? If you don't have a self, it doesn't matter where you were born in the caste system. You can, it wasn't your karma that made you, and so you can do whatever you want. And of course, that's the logic, that maintains a merchant economy, right? The whole caste system was to maintain that the social stability wasn't fragmented by the so-called nouveau riche, right? They wanted to make sure there were no nouveau riche, and the Buddha's like, no, we like the nouveau riche. We want them to be Buddhists, and of course, this is the engine that drives the tradition. With all of this happening, again, one of the things that happens, getting into the larger structural elements of this, urbanization is one of the big things that Buddhism drives across Asia. And I think Buddhism is probably one of the most pro-urban religions in the world. You can just look at the statistics up here, and of course there's the famous Buddhist prophecy of like, in the future, the world will just be one massive megalopolis. And of course now in our environmental world, that sounds like a total dystopia, even though we're kind of going in that direction. But for the Buddhists, that was great. They loved the city. Everything about the city was phenomenal. Of course, that's where you can make money. That was the world of the merchant elite. And so the tradition just, glorifies cities. But they didn't just glorify it in the text. Historically, we know when monasteries were built, basically urbanization happened. And of course, that results in all of the problems environmentally that cities bring with them. And particularly, Donald Hughes has the idea of the Great Divorce, which means, once the walls of Uruk were built, basically the separation of humanity and nature began, and then the destruction began. But Mark Elvin, an environmental historian of China, has a better idea, or not a better, but I mean a different idea called decisional distance. When you live in the city, you don't necessarily have to think about where your stuff comes from. When you buy a fish taco here in Boulder, how did that fish get here, right? I just paid for it. I don't have to think about some fisherman up in Alaska, how it was shipped over on planes, and how much fuel was used to do it. And again, this kind of urban environment that the Buddhist tradition resides in, again, if you read the Buddhist text, there is no glorification of nature. Nature is always a bad thing. It's always a sign of decay and impermanence. It's something to be avoided. There is no romantic Buddhist view of the natural world. And this is one of my favorite kind of passages that kind of encapsulates the Buddhist view of nature. They use, the Buddhist, they describe the Buddhist skill in debating by a small child smashing the legs of a crab. I mean, to me, that's just a horrific image, but that's the Buddhist view. It's like, it shows how good the Buddha is in a debate. A small child torturing a defenseless creature. And again, tied into this, as I mentioned before, is the agricultural expansion. I mean, some of you may have seen monastic robes that they have the squares on them. Why they have the squares is because one day the Buddha was walking up on this mountain and with his disciple Ananda, looked out over the horizon, and again, this would be a perfect time to say, oh, look at the beautiful sunset, and talk about nature in a positive way. And instead what he says, I love all this agricultural field. And so that's why he says, that's wonderful. So he decreed, it's in the Vinaya, that all monks have to have this on their robe. So literally, agricultural expansion and human domination of nature is actually sewn into the fabric of Buddhist monastic robes. And again, this is, and again, the Buddhist texts are filled with how to farm, and so these parables of how to farm. There's even descriptions of how to make irrigation tubes and irrigation canals, and the Buddha is the one who's giving these teachings. And so Buddhists obviously took this to account. There's been a lot of great archaeology done on early Buddhism, and it's been shown that wherever Buddhists established themselves, they brought irrigation technology with them. They were kind of like the irrigation engineers of the pre-modern world, and this was part of their kind of proselytizing or missionary work, that they could, come in and bring these, new technologies with them. And again, the connection between this is found in Northwest India and Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia. And so this is the work of Janice Stargart, who's in Cambridge, and she was studying this Buddhist polity called Satingpra in southern Thailand. And you can see the numbers. I mean, from the 9th to the 12th century, they expanded their irrigation canal system for 76 square miles. So huge territory and huge kind of earth moving and transformation of the natural landscape. And this had, of course, profound effects on how much they could produce, and of course how many people they can sustain, and of course how much money, and all the rest of it. And so again, when you look at Buddhist agricultural expansion, the amount of land that monasteries owned, it's just astronomical. In Korea, monasteries owned 1/6 of the land. In 10th century Fuzhou in China, they owned half of the land. And the guy, Michael Walsh, who's done all this, crunched the numbers. One monk pretty much owned 50 acres of land, and the average peasant owned half an acre of land. So this is the kind of wealth disparity and the kind of wealth and power that these institutions have. And of course, what were they doing with this land? Well, they had slaves working it. They were, of course, cutting all the trees and selling it to the emperor to make ships and God knows what. And so this is massive environmental transformation in order to promote the Dharma. And finally, another thing it's important to recognize, that when Buddhists went around Asia, bringing irrigation technology, bringing their prosperity gospel, promoting the commodification of the natural world in order to glorify the Buddha and his teachings, they also brought crops with them. right? And then particularly they were the ones who transported these 4 crops across Asia. There's all of these folkloric stories that, the Buddha and rice were born at the same time. And of course, rice, to make 1 ton of rice, you need 900 tons of water. And of course, that's where the irrigation technology comes in. And so again, Buddhism, when they spread with their monasteries, they bring rice with them. Buddhists were also the first people who crystallized sugar, right? I mean, sugar cane is of course, it's like whatever created the modern world, of course, with the Caribbean and the slave trade and all the rest of it. And there's a whole shelf of books on looking at all of these commodities, how they created the modern world. But Buddhists were the ones who did this in the ancient world. They were the ones who transported they developed crystal sugar in India. Went across the Silk Road, and of course that now why we eat sweet and sour pork in Chinese cuisine, because the Buddhists gave them sugar, and they incorporated it through rituals and practices and giving, and so sugar. Obviously, why they were growing sugar down in the Caribbean is sugar is one of the most environmentally destructive plants. It destroys nature, takes all the resources, so you have to keep moving it around. And of course, the same thing happened in Asia. Finally, cotton. Of course, again, the whole modern world was built on cotton, beginning with Manchester and then the slave states in the South. But originally, it was Buddhists who controlled the cotton market. Cotton, it's a different form of cotton in India than it is in the West. But they were the ones who controlled the market in cotton, and they sold it to most of it to Rome. We have certain documents showing the Roman ships came to India. There were 340-ton ships, and they were just bringing all this back. And the Buddhists, there was so much money coming into the Buddhist monasteries, they didn't know what to do with it. And they were the first ones to create, now we all work in universities, we work in universities, we all know about endowments. They created the first endowments, and it's kind of financial development. It's a Sanskrit term, but it means undying capital. And so basically, people would give so much money, and instead of giving monks every year, like new robes, new clothes, they basically just lived on the interest produced by these massive endowments, just like universities work today. But again, this financial innovation happened 2,000 years ago. And then, of course, finally, tea. As everybody knows, it was the Buddhists who introduced tea to China, and then, of course, changed, drinking cultures all over East Asia, and then, of course, in the British Empire as well. And so, these are 4 commodities that, all kinds of historians have pointed out they changed the world. But it was Buddhists who were at the forefront of this. So what I argue in the book is that we need to have a new Columbian exchange. I call it the Buddhist exchange, of course. There's also known the Islamic exchange that happened earlier. But again, if to tie together all of these things, what tied Asia together was all of these developments: agricultural expansion, urbanization, monetization, and again, the Buddhists were at the forefront of it. So to tie it all together, hopefully I convinced you that my 3 historiographical interventions have some validity. But again, to go back to the Grinchitude question, if you still think I'm just an evil person who has demeaned a tradition that deserves better, I end my book by saying, or trying to argue completely the opposite. As we all know, we are facing a climate catastrophe. And it's always a question of, will we change? Can we change? And I think the Buddhist tradition is a great example that actually has changed. They were proto-capitalist, environmental destroyers and exploiters and all the rest of it for thousands of years. But over the last 150 years, they have profoundly changed. And in many ways, they are now at the forefront of environmental activism in Asia. The famous monks in Southeast Asia who are, basically making monks into trees so they won't cut down. There's a famous monk, Korean nun, who's argued against the whole kind of economic development at all costs. So again, we live in tough times, and I always trying to find hope somewhere. And I think the history of Buddhism, that they have changed, give us an example of that maybe we do have a glimmer of hope that we too can change because they did. Thank you.
That was even more provocative than I'd hoped. I'm sure there will be many questions from everyone in the audience challenging some of these ideas, and I'd love you to bat back at them. But just let me start. Buddhism, you said, is about making money, but surely it is absolutely at the heart of Buddhist doctrine that you are talking about giving up possessions, giving up your goods. I mean, I know the arguments that early Buddhist monasteries had possessions, that they had slaves, that they were on trade routes, that merchants were giving them things. But nonetheless, the heart of the doctrine is giving up your wealth.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to my thing of the three Buddhist actors, as I call them. Yes, I mean, that is the ultimate ideal, right? And that's what the monks do. But again, there are very, very few of the people who actually do it, right? And so, I mean, again, to be an unproductive monk in the monastery and doing the difficult meditation practice or preserving the manuscripts or whatever you're doing, somebody needs to pay for that. Right, and so that's what the laity is. And again, this is based on scholars who've done the kind of demographic work in Southeast Asia. 1% of Buddhists are monks. So it's the other people.
And what percentage in this argument of those Buddhist monks are meditative, introspective figures? I mean,
it's very small. Very, very small. I mean, I don't know. I'm off the top of my head, but I mean, the meditating monk, which of course is like the sine qua non, like what we think of as being Buddhist, was a very, very elite core.
But the fact that in order to have the excess capital or to give to, I mean, like the famous quote that it was Nehru who said, it costs us a fortune to keep Gandhi in poverty. in the same way, you need, both the Jains and the Buddhists have these very rich merchant communities who enable the monks to live in poverty. And you can't have one without the other, because if no one's got excess capital, the monks starve to death, or no one's got excess food.
Jains starve themselves to death anyway.
Yeah, but even when they're trying not to starve themselves to death, they need people to give them their meals and the meals that they're allowed. So surely there's a contradiction there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is also Weber's, problem or whatever. I mean, but it's with every ascetic tradition, right? You hold up that ideal, but again, like with the Jains, I mean, they're probably the wealthiest community in India, right? I mean, diamond merchants and all the rest of it. But then, you look at what the monks do, and I think that's kind of the genius of Mahavira and the Buddha. They were basically social engineers, or that's the way.
And crucially, living at a time when urbanization was just beginning.
Yeah,
when international trade was just beginning.
Yeah, I mean, and money was coming in, right? Yeah. I mean. So that that was a radical innovation of the axial age, and they were the ones who basically said, yes, let's go with this. And and so that they created this community, and again, the doctrine of the transfer of merit. I mean, the field of merit, right? That's the foundational component.
That by giving to a monastery, you earn merit. Which,
and the monk. I mean, again, we have this idea that the monk is supposed to be meditating, and that's their function. Their real function is to be a field of merit, right? They live according to the Vinaya, the 257 rules, and as a result of living that incredibly difficult, morally righteous life, they become spiritually charged, right? And so when you give to a monk, you're getting karma points, whatever you want to call it, in return. If I give money to a homeless person, that's a very nice gesture, but I'm not getting karma points. It's the fact. I mean, so that's the social structure of the Dharma, right? Right?
Dharma miles.
I mean, it's not this. I mean, it's the same. I mean, like the fact, the main function of the monk is to be a field of merit for the laity, right? At the same time, yes, some are seeking nirvana and doing the hardcore meditation practice and all the rest of it. But the main thing is this social relationship, and which is, it's ritually based on the karma theory, and that's what maintains it. And again, it doesn't matter if you're the Theravada or Mahayana or Tantra or whatever. That's the social structure of the tradition. And so this idea of giving, which is built into this thing, in order to maintain that, you do need to have capital.
Now, two things you just dropped very casually into the conversation that I think I'd love you to expand about, that I'm sure would have surprised some of the listeners. The idea that Buddhist monks had slaves as one, And secondly, the idea that Buddhist monasteries were banks. Mm-hmm. These are not ideas that most people are familiar with. You just go into those two things.
Yeah. I mean, again, in America, slavery is just so, focused on the Atlantic slave trade, and rightfully so. But, historically, the largest slave market was Asia, and particularly China had the largest slave market in the world. And so, again, kind of the Eurocentric, it's like all about the West. In the slavery studies, Asia is kind of minimized. But slaves were endemic to the Buddhist world, right? Again, as you look at every inscription for the land grant of a monastery, it is, a certain number of slaves are going to be incorporated. And again, this is the, again, the popular view of Buddhism is all, righteous and moral and good and peaceful. But that's a modern creation. Right? And so again, if you look at the sources, you look at the description, like Greg Chopin and scholars like that, it's all there, right? But again, people just kind of don't want to talk about it. So in a certain sense, it's like now,
just again to give in a sense the primary evidence that Chopin and everyone is quoting, just explain to people here what are the sources, what is the evidence that Buddhist monks once had slaves in large numbers?
Well, the one I mentioned is land grants. So when a king is going to endow a monastery, he puts up an inscription saying, "I'm doing this for the Dharma and for the future of the faith and all the rest of it. And in order to do that, I'm giving the monastery, 1,000 acres. I'm going to have, that's given to the monastery, and I'm also giving you 1,000 slaves to work that land, and that's all karmic merit, and long live the Dharma."
And this just to clarify for people listening here who don't know this, that there are inscriptions which give this evidence, which predate the earliest Buddhist texts, even that these. In first, second century BC, Western Ghats, you get these inscriptions.
Yeah, so and when I'm talking about this in my book, I have one inscription from Vietnam, one inscription from Thailand, one from Tibet, one from China, one from India, and they're all the same. The structure's the same, and so this is just across Asia. The slavery.
And the second idea, which I'm sure will have surprised people here, the idea that Buddhist monasteries, these otherworldly places, that the shorthand when you've got a kind of Marvel movie, and you have some monk learning martial arts up in Tibet, and this is the opposite end from Wall Street. The Marvel movie then moves to Wall Street for the clash of ideas. But you're saying that those wonderful mountaintop retreats up in Bhutan or Tibet were lending money at interest.
Yeah, and the argument of the one like the monastery up in the hinterlands, that goes back to Jacques Journet's book from 1956, Buddhism and the Economic History of China. And he's like, why are these monasteries out in these weird places? And they're basically the frontier of the commodity market. They went there in order to get the resources that were out there. But and so again, this kind of monetization of course, when they built the monastery, the locals didn't have money, and so but then they're brought into the capitalist system of the Buddhist ecumen, and so that's this kind of projection into the frontier. And you look at Ashoka, right? He's the famous inscriptions all around the empire. Every single one is on a gold mine or a diamond mine. And
the largest excavation of at the moment going on of any Buddhist monastery is Mezainak in Afghanistan, which is on the largest copper deposit, which is why the Chinese are about to blow the whole thing up and level it.
Yeah, and but the Buddhists were there first in doing it. One author said the production of copper there was on an industrial scale. It's just the tailings are just massive.
Just one quibble. You made a very good argument that the Buddha liked agriculture and that there's no glorification of wild nature, that nature is something beyond the monastery, full of nagas and yakshis and frightening things which might hungry ghosts. But you also get, I think, in early Buddhist texts, a great love of gardens and beautiful views. And the fact, we go as travelers to see Buddhist monasteries often because they are still in incredibly beautiful places, always. Mm-hmm. And Chopin has an essay where he talks about the love of beauty. So it isn't that they're against beautiful things and gardens, but it's a tamed nature.
Yeah, I mean, and that's Chopin's argument. I mean, it's like, yes, they are in beautiful places, but in many of them, they're in beautiful places because originally there was nothing there, and, you know, I mean, but what Chopin is saying is like this, it's an aestheticization of nature, right? It's like you don't want, like, nature in tooth and claw. You want it contained. I mean, everybody here is familiar with, like, the Japanese garden or the Chinese garden. And, you know, I mean, as several scholars have pointed out, those gardens started appearing when they had lost touch with nature, right? I mean, it's just kind of like an ikebana and all the rest. It's just like this aestheticization of nature that happens when you're in an urban environment.
That's in a late.
It's a late period. I mean, like Hiroshi Rani, I mean, who works on Japan, like, you know, the whole argument is that this happens as a result of you know, they have lost touch with nature, and it's like this romantic recreation of nature that they've lost. And also, I mean, like, Greg Clunas, you know, has the great argument about, like, to have a Chinese garden, you have to have a lot of money to do that, and plus to have a garden like that, you're not producing crops, right? In order to do that, you have to be wealthy. So I mean, so these two things are interconnected, right? So you've lost touch with nature, and you have the wherewithal in order to have a beautiful garden.
And again, just to quibble, cotton exists before Buddhism, and it's not Buddhist monks that are running the cotton trade. It's merchants who may be Buddhists, but they're...
It's both, actually. I mean, so
Yeah.
there are, I mean, in the Vinaya, there are regulations about, like, how they should maintain the cotton industry. And so, you know, and Janta, there's a famous mural of,
Yes.
of the women doing the spooling. But so it was both, actually. I mean, and so again,
Really?
like, I mean, we think like the monks aren't doing anything. But they were totally intertwined. I mean, like, you know, I mean, the Vinayas, like, you know, they're getting all of these things, like, you know, shipping boats and, you know, all these, like, irrigation canals. And, of course, you know, the monks have to come up with some legal logic in order to justify this. And, of course, they come up with logic. And so, you know, I mean, and then, you know, I mean, like, at the time, you know, Indian plays just routinely made fun of Buddhist monks because they were just, like, the lascivious rich guys.
Wandering around with a skull.
Yeah. And so, you know, but so, yeah, the cotton industry was run by both. But I mean, it was certainly largely the merchants. I mean.
Before I open it up to the argument to the audience, a quick thing to say that there is at this moment in the Met in New York an astonishing exhibition called Tree and Serpent.
Trees and Serpents.
And which is about early Buddhism. And very much is about this world of these spirits living in the jungle beyond monasteries. The serpents in question are the Nagas, who are the symbol of kind of water spirits outside the monastic world, and then the Akshis and the Akshas are the male and female nature spirits who represent all that hasn't been tamed by the monks, and the monks' job is to tame them, in a sense, to bring them within the
to cut them down, to put it in one way.
So over to you guys. Can we have the lights on so we can see? I can see lots of hands go up immediately, which is a very good sign. This gentleman here. There will be, I think, microphones coming. Yeah.
Please wait for the microphone to get to you, and we have a few minutes, so we might
How
not
long
be
have we
able
got?
to get everybody.
How many minutes have we got for questions? 7 minutes. Okay. So.
Okay, thank you for that enlightening and fascinating talk. It obviously created some nice cognitive dissonance for me. I had two comments and a question. One is, if I look at some of the examples you gave by some of the monks, and you made a comment specifically, the Buddha said, you know, it's perfectly fine to, live a capitalistic life and accumulate wealth. It goes totally in odds with what we know about Buddha during his lifetime, where ascetic life, go out there begging for alms and so on and so forth. And then the second point I noticed, the Buddhist exchange listed was 300 BCE, right, before Christian era, all the way to 800 CE. That's stanza 9 here. Buddha passed away, rough guess, 450 years before Christian era, which means there was a period of 150 years. The question is, are these things that we think attribute to Buddha is not really to Buddha, but his monks and the whole organization that set up did that. So Are we attributing this to Buddha or for the organization of the monastics, etc., that created this?
In other words, if I understand your question, is the Buddhist monastic system leading the Buddhist ideals astray? Is there a difference between
Because
what the
there's a 150-year difference.
and the Sangha?
Well, I mean, to quote Stephen Collins, we cannot know anything about early Buddhism. The corpus, the Theravada corpus, was written in Sri Lanka, 1,000 miles away from where the Buddha lived, at the same time, we don't know when the Buddha lived. Right? There's a huge.
And Buddhism is archaeologically invisible for its first at least 250 years.
Yeah, I mean, so. And so the 300, I just kind of threw that up there when I was doing my PowerPoint slide. But yeah, so there's what was going on in that earlier period and when he lived is we don't know, basically. But I mean, so then to say like.
So can we just have some other questions and come back if we've only got a short time? At the back here, sir. Yes, this gentleman here. This gentleman next to Sanjoy.
There's a person over there.
Okay, we've already got a mic. Sorry, you next, then the person next to Sanjoy after.
This is fascinating, Johan. It sort of contradicts what we were brought up with in terms of the emergence of Buddha and Buddhism in India. I was wondering, if you look at the evolution of religious history and religious development, how would you compare Buddhism was supposed to be a reform Hinduism, and is that supported by your research? And then how do you the monks, the monasteries are resident of the development of Christianity in Europe. How would you compare the development of Christianity as an economic and environmental, possibly exploitative system compared to Buddhism? Thank you.
I'll take the second question first. I mean, and I think there's a lot of parallels between the two. Peter Brown is a famous historian of Christianity, and of course, if you read the Bible, I mean, we all know what Jesus said about wealthy, right? They had the same possibility of entering heaven as a camel passing through the eye of a needle. I mean, you know, to confuse things, he was a communist or whatever. I mean, he just despised wealth. But then, of course, as Peter Brown shows...
And there's a distinction, very clear distinction with Buddhism, where the first disciples, what are they called? Bulika and Trabika, or what's the name?
Yeah, Trapuzambalika, yeah.
Yeah, who are merchants.
Yeah, and they say, we don't want to be monks. And, like, what can we do? And he says, well, here's some amulets, pray to them, and, like, you won't get stuck in the desert. I mean, from the very beginning of the Buddha biography, I mean, it's all laying out the groundwork of this social structure. But so, I mean, for the kind of you know, in Christianity, as Peter Brown shows, like when Christianity is adopted as the religion of the empire, you know, and wealth is part of the imperial process, Christian theology changes, right? And the same thing happens in the Middle Ages. You know, the question of usury. I mean, it was outlawed in Christianity as it is in Islam.
And in both religions, you have the same thing about violence. Both the non-violent religions, but when they become state religions, states have to have armies.
Yeah, I mean, and there's always a distinction between, like, you know, normative claims and how it's actually practiced. I mean, Jesus said, "Turn the other cheek." If all Christians had done that, you know, European history would be very different. And you know, I mean, so it's again like, you know, I mean, there's always that tension in every religious tradition. And so, you know, but I mean, I still think, you know, going back to this earlier question about when was this codified and all, and who did what, and I mean, it's really hard since we have no, you know, sources from the very, very early period. But once it's up and running and we have evidence, we have inscriptions, we have text, all of this language about wealth production and money being good, and, you know, that's part of the system and how Buddhism functions, is there from the get-go.
Okay, I just had a real simple question. I'm not a scholar on this, so I don't know too much about it, but I'm just wondering about the element of militarism in Buddhist history. I just have a vague memory that in Japan, something like that happened. So was there coercion and also converting others to Buddhism, or what did you find as far as that goes?
Yeah, I mean, so like, is this, I talk about like, Donna Lopez's book, The Post-Colonial Turn, all of these like, the modern construction of Buddhism. That Buddhism is rational. Everybody's gone back and said, no, it's totally irrational. Buddhism is all about meditation. Like, no, it's all about ritual and pilgrimage and, funeral rites and all the rest of it. And of course, one of the staples in this Buddhist modernism is that Buddhism is peaceful. And there's now a shelf of books that just, it shows that Buddhism is as soaked in blood as every other religious tradition. And of course, you only need to look at Sri Lanka and Myanmar today to see that. I mean, so Buddhism has a long tradition of just war theory, to defend the Dharma, support the Dharma, and to spread the Dharma. I mean, again, one of the famous Ashoka inscriptions, one of the earliest Buddhist things we have, he builds it on this gold mine, and he basically tells the native inhabitants, I'm the new sheriff in town, and don't go against me. And then, of course, he puts it in the language of ahimsa. This is all done for, nonviolence. And I mean, I would draw the parallel. It's like America invades Iraq. It's all for freedom and democracy, right? The language is being used in very different ways. And so
in a sense, it's just the eternal,
it's justification.
The eternal thing between an ideal and the reality of human existence.
Yeah.
That however strong an ideal at the beginning,
Yeah.
it'll have to make its way in a world that is corrupt and violent and based on money.
Which the Buddha said.
I recommend Johan's work to anyone that has been intrigued by this very counterintuitive and possibly provocative presentation. Apologies if anyone's been offended, but I do recommend this as a deeply interesting take, whether you agree or not with the conclusions that Johan draws. And I have hugely enjoyed your work, sir. So thank you. Great pleasure to get you here.